Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I was surprised to learn that it wasn't just Joseph Smith's family that had early connections to Masonry and magic. It turns out Oliver Cowdery's family had connections as well. In our next conversation with historian Clair Barrus, we're going to get acquainted with him and learn more about these connections with Oliver Cowdery. Check out our conversation. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I have a very good scholar, even though you're not a professional historian. But could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Clair Barrus, and I am, as Rick said, a amateurish. I'm an okay historian, but untrained.
Okay, so you've got some. I hate to say this, but you have been doing Mormon blogging longer than anybody I know. I think that's true, because you've got a great blog. Could you tell us this day in Mormon history? Isn't that what it's called?
Right. Well, yeah, and before that, I had quite early in the blogosphere era, I created Mormon Chronicles, which I did for about 10 years, which is a really good. If anybody wants a documented history of the Mormon Church during the maybe from late 90s into somewhere into the 2000s. It's great. It's a great chronology and resource. But yes, at some point I did start Today in Mormon History.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
And it was kind of an afterthought, but I created it, and it's actually it's run by computer and databases. I'm a computer guy, and so this thing is kind of semi-automated, and it just cranks out every day some interesting things, and some of it's really quite interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've seen some of this stuff, and it's really cool. It's really cool. And isn't there a third one, or no? Is it just those two?
Well, I blog at withoutend.org.
Okay.
And sometimes it's called Worlds Without End. And yeah, so that's my most recent area for blogging, and I have maybe a dozen and a half articles on there.
Didn't that used to be a group blog?
It is a group blog.
It still is a group blog.
It was owned by Christopher Smith, a great historian. It's now run by Brian Whitney, great historian also.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's a publisher, a Colford Books publisher dude. And,
Brian's a good guy.
Good guy, yep.
So, well, cool. So you, like I said, so you've been doing this since the 90s. Like, I hate to say you're an old man in Mormon history, but aren't you?
Well, I was, to really show
that would be a better way to say it.
To show my ancientness, I was actually online in 1984 on the internet when only engineering firms and universities were on the internet.
That's what I thought.
Very briefly, but in 88 I got on, and I've been on consistently ever since. In 88 it would take a week to get email from here to the East Coast. Just to give you a sense of how primitive it was. And so, yeah, I'm an old dinosaur.
Was this like Prodigy or AOL or something else?
It was before. I remember when AOL and Prodigy came online. This was pre-anything. You had to work at an engineering firm, and some universities had access.
So like the ARPANET?
Oh, yeah, it was the ARPANET. Yeah,
it
was pre-internet. It was the ARPANET.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
So yeah.
You're very experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been around for a while.
Well, all right. So I know you've done some awesome presentations here at Sunstone, and so we'd like to talk a little bit about that. And so what was your first presentation that you did?
Well, my first one was on Oliver Cowdery's rod at DNC 8 and the earlier versions of that. And I dove into that. Michael Marquardt mentored me in that enterprise, and then they told me that my respondent. I was terrified to be presenting a paper, and then they told me Michael Quinn was going to respond to my paper.
Oh my goodness!
And I almost died, and I shook through the whole thing.
I think that was at MHA, wasn't it, a few years ago?
No, that was at Sunstone.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and it was a decade ago or something. I don't know. It was quite a while ago. But I did a few papers. I did one on MHA on the rod and on Freemasonry, actually. And
then I think I remember that one.
I've done some others. I did one on Sodom and Gomorrah and kind of an analysis of the chiastic structural analysis of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And I did, and most recently, I've done some others, but most recently I did one on the elect ladies of the early republic, Emma Smith, Jemima Wilkinson, and Anne Lee, all called elect ladies, just like Emma was. And I did an analysis of gender, sexuality, and religious authority under a patriarchal, repressive blanket. And it was really fascinating to look at these women in that context. And so that was last year.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, and I know somebody said that she was actually elected. That's why she was an elect lady.
Yep. Joseph Smith said that. Yes, he said you're an elect. Yeah, he'd earlier said you're an elect lady in an early revelation in 1830. And then 12 years later, he said, well, the reason you're elect lady is because they elected you to be the president of the Relief Society. It was a capitulation, I believe, on his part. But, yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Masonry and magic. What can you tell us about that?
I can tell you a fair amount.
Yeah. Take it away.
Well, okay. Let me start in 1798. Well,
okay.
And we'll actually go back before that. But let's start there with Oliver Cowdery, if I may. Well, actually, there's two topics we may be talking about: Royal Arch Masonry, Masonic influences, and then magic. And which do you want to talk about?
Let's hit them both.
Okay, we'll just dive in.
Okay.
Well, let me start with Oliver Cowdery and his father, William Cowdery. And I think there's some interesting early Masonic influences that may have come through Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery's father was actually involved very early on in a group called the New Israelites. And when you think of New Israelites, compare that with Latter-day Saints. New and latter are related, and saints and Israelites are related. So you have an interesting relationship just in the naming there. The New Israelites were a very interesting group of people up in Vermont that William Cowdery was involved with. And they used rods a lot. They were rodsmen, and they would use rods to get revelations through. And when they created a religious movement, and they had a dietary code, restrictions, just has an interesting parallel to the word of wisdom. They wanted to build a new Jerusalem. They actually would use their divining rods to gather gold under the underground gold, and they had vast heaps of gold, and they were going to use that gold to pave the streets of their new Jerusalem. And they got a revelation. Nathaniel Wood, who was the leader, got a revelation that they should build a temple. Now, this is interesting because think about it. Who built? What temple builders are there in American religious history? It's the Mormons, or the Latter-day Saints, and the New Israelites, and the Masons. The Masons are they're symbolic temple builders. The interior of every Masonic lodge is a temple. And up until that was it before Joseph Smith. So I think this is an interesting, unique parallel. And if anyone knows of another temple builder before Joseph Smith, I would love to know. Please let me know. So anyway, they and one of the other.
Let me ask you this, because I know we talk Jewish. They call their synagogues temples.
Yes,
but that would be something different. Is that right?
Yeah. They and I don't think they were temple in the same sense of like this is like Solomon's temple, but for Mormons, it's a temple like Solomon's temple, and for the Masons, it was Solomon's temple, and so the synagogue it doesn't fit.
Because I know some synagogues, and I want to say Temple Beth Israel or something like that. I've heard those kinds of names for synagogues,
Yep.
but they're very different from
It's different,
a Mormon
in a
or
different
Mason
context.
or
Yes.
what was the other one you mentioned? The New Israel.
The New
Temple.
Israelites, yes,
Okay.
the New Israelites. Yeah. Another interesting thing is that they would, patriarchal blessings in Mormon history and currently in the Latter-day Saint tradition and I suspect other traditions, the patriarch declares the Israelite lineage, which of the 12 tribes somebody belongs to. The New Israelites did the same thing. They would use their rods, and they would use the rod to determine what tribe people came from and declare their lineage, which is really quite fascinating. Anyway, they started to build their temple, and they kind of declared an apocalyptic end of the world. Here's a clue. If you're ever going to create a religion and you're going to have the end of the world, don't predict the date, at least not in your lifetime. If it fails, then you got things to deal with. He predicted a date, and of course, nothing happened. But they had, but the locals got very scared, and there were shots that were fired, and then later the group ends up disbanding. Actually, they set a second date, end of the world date, and then that didn't work out, and then that was the end of their group. But shots were fired, and today you can Google wood scrape, and you can read about the wood scrape, which was Nathaniel Wood, Oliver Cowdery's father, most likely a member of this group, and it's quite interesting. So what's even more interesting is Oliver Cowdery shows up then on Joseph Smith's doorstep on, I think, early April 1829, and later in June, I believe, sometime in June, which isn't much later, Joseph Smith has a revelation about a rod that Oliver Cowdery has. And in the earliest, this is in D&C 6 and 8 that talk about this rod. And we have earlier versions of D&C 8, and in there they specifically mention rod and even the word sprout that Oliver had. And it was considered to be the rod of Aaron. And Joseph, through this revelation, tells Oliver that this has told you many things in the past before meeting Joseph Smith. So Oliver has a rod. He's getting revelations through it. No other group is getting revelations. They divine for buried water and treasure, but as far as getting a revelation from God through it, that's a different level. Oliver is getting that just like the New Israelites are, and it's validated in this revelation that Joseph Smith gets. So that's an interesting tie-in. Seems to reach back to the New Israelite days.
So these rods are like dowsing rods, or are they
Yeah.
like a magic wand, or
Well, the word wand and rod are used interchangeably in discussing these things. Sometimes it's called a wand. You're catching me with faint memory, and I may have this wrong, but I believe that Joseph Smith's uncle wrote Joseph Smith Sr., or it may have been Hiram or somebody. He wrote a letter to one of the Smiths, and he was upset. And one of the things he's upset about is that somebody is using a wand. I think he uses the term wand. And it may have been Joseph Smith Sr.'s use of a rod, that he would use that for treasure seeking. And again, I'm going from ancient memory back here, and I probably have some details wrong, but there was a letter written, and it was about a rod or a wand, but they're used interchangeably, and it's like a dowsing rod. And some of them were forked, a Y-shaped rod, and some were two L-shaped rods that they'd hold in their hands, and when they got to the right place where the water or minerals were buried, they would cross, and they would say, aha, here's where we need to go. The New Israelites, though, they would sit around in a circle, and they would ask a question, and then everybody's rod would nod in assent to whatever. If it was a yes, we agree, the rods would all dip in assent, is how it's described in somebody who wrote about that.
This sounds pretty foreign for Mormonism, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, we don't. So the use of the rod continued was used in Mormonism past Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery recorded some stuff in the Patriarchal Book, and he talks kind of about a rod kind of as an authoritative thing, and he kind of describes a rod with him giving him power in kind of a symbolic sense. But Heber C. Kimball, he had a rod. Brigham Young said he had a dream about getting a rod from Joseph Smith. Heber C. Kimball had a rod, and he would pray. Sometimes he would pray to the Lord Rod. He would dress in his temple clothes. He would kneel down, hold the rod, pray to the Lord Rod, and he would get a revelation.
So give me an approximate year for this, because you just blew me away when you said temple clothes. I was thinking this was pre 1830.
Okay.
So this is after
Heber C.
18...
Kimball after Joseph Smith, 1850s, 1860s.
So 1860s, he's dressing up in his temple robes and he's using these rods. Wow.
Yes, yeah, using this rod. So I've gone up and I've looked at, there's a book called the Heber C. Kimball Memoranda book, and the first part of it contains a bunch of records about who owed money while they're crossing the plains and all this stuff, really boring stuff like that. One day somebody is thumbing through it and in the back finds all these revelations that he recorded, and a number of them are through the rod. He'll say, I received this revelation through the rod on February 2nd, 1856. And in fact, sometimes there's multiple versions of a revelation. And in fact, I do one of my presentations at Sunstone is about, and I think it's on this Worlds Without End blog, but it's called The Wild, not the Wild Women Revelation. Maybe that was it. It was, I think, I can't quite remember. I wasn't prepared to talk about this.
Sorry.
But we're off there. That's fine.
Yeah, there's a reason why we call this Gospel Tangents. We go off on places.
It's something like the Wild Women Revelation. And so he speaks in this extremely esoteric language. You read it, and it's like really symbolic, and it's just, you're like, what in the world is he talking about? But then there's another version of it that contains additional text. And as I recall, the additional text is, it changes tense. So it's like in first person, and then it switches to like third person. But the second part of it clarifies what the first part was talking about. And I almost wonder if he dictated the first part, and then later he's like, man, nobody's going to get this. I need part 2 of the revelation. I don't know, but it's a fascinating one, and so I take a stab at interpreting this revelation, and I think that it's about his disobedient wives. They won't listen.
Heber Kimball's wives.
Heber C. Kimball's. He had 50 some odd wives, and a large percentage of them end up divorcing him. And he is obviously extremely frustrated that he's like, in his mind, he's like, why can't they just obey me like I obey Brother Brigham? It's simple. You just do it. You don't, but these women, these darn women are, in his mind, are independent-minded, and they all want to do this and that, and 56, that's a lot of, in his mind, he's trying to keep all these women happy, and they're making demands on his time, and anyway, so he has a revelation, and basically the revelation gives him permission to dismiss his wives that are not obedient to him.
It's a little self-serving, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and it's apparent that he is really wrestling. I mean, you can tell he is at his wit's end, and there's some interesting speeches he gives that kind of backs up his views about how he thinks women at that time should act in this very patriarchal society. And he's in the first presidency, and I think he thinks that they should be as obedient as he is to Brother Brigham. And So that's a fascinating revelation, and I wish I was a little more prepared to talk about it. But he has other revelations. He predicts. He does some predictions about Congress and about the United States crumbling, and there's some really fun stuff in this memorandum book. So anyway.
Cool. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Clair Barrus. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about D&C 10. That's the one that many of us are familiar with to study it out in our minds when we want to receive revelation. Did you know that Oliver Cowdery had a rod of revelation that was supposed to help him with this task?
And so Joseph had a seer stone through which he translated. Oliver has a rod, and I think that, my guess is that was what he was supposed to translate through, because he'd been getting revelations through it already, just like Joseph had been getting revelations through his seer stone. Both are treasure-seeking tools. It's like, why wouldn't it be? It seems the most obvious thing.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents, and for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/GospelTangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.